you shall not participate in the final discussion. What's that? I think so. Oh, yeah, 2. It ends at 2. 12:30 to 2. So, and there's some more copies. Paul, do you have a public service announcement? You pointing to my zipper? Thank goodness the video hasn't started yet. That would not be safeguarding God's people. Are we done? You got the big one? Perfect. You ready to start, Chris? You don't have to look at them. Some people like to have notes. Did you not get any? There we come. All right, so let's get started. Chris, I think we're filming now. Is that right? Excellent. So thank you all for your graciousness in our 2-week gap as I tried to kill myself with COVID. I have been testing positive for a while, but I now am coughing more than I ever did, or I'm testing negative, but I'm now coughing more than I did when I was positive. So if I have a coughing fit, well, I don't know. You've all got masks on. But I've got a sucker in my mouth to try and solve that problem. I first want to respond to a little critique I got from someone in this class, and it was a recognition that at some point I had talked about the value of siblings and whatnot, and she said to me, Eric, I don't have siblings. I never have. And I think there was kind of a sense of that part of the lecture she felt left out on. So if ever I'm sharing something, I do my best to try and make it as broadly applicable as possible. But if there's some things that I share that simply aren't true of you, I don't mean to leave you out. It might be true for someone else, so I'm sorry if I was insensitive to anyone at any point, or if I will become insensitive today. I truly am trying to say things that I think are broadly true of this human life. So because we've had a few weeks since our last lecture, I'm just going to review my 2 basic premises for this whole class. And the first one is that the aging process itself is holy. And what I base that on, quite frankly, is because that's the way God made it. This life involves the process from birth to death, and not just for us as humans, but everything in creation goes through this same process, even rocks. You know, inanimate things, everything is being formed and building and slowly breaking down. And if that is the pattern for God's entire creation, then I have to believe that the entire process matters. And it is natural for us to prefer health and growth and productivity and comfort, all those kind of generative stages. Of course we prefer that. It feels better. That's reasonable. But it doesn't mean that the latter half of life, or that the first half of life is superior to the latter half. It might be more comfortable, but God has to value the second half as much as the first half. And especially if we take as a basic ground rule that a significant purpose of life is formation, then the entire process is formation. And by formation, I mean, who are we becoming? Who are we knowing ourselves to be? And I do think, at least for us as humans, I can't speak what it's like for a raccoon, but for us as humans, clearly this process of making meaning out of who we are and what our place is in the world, that is just this human experience. And that whole process leads to that sense of formation. And we all know from various points in our life that it's the transitions that are often the most formative, and the suffering is often the most formative. That's where we really have to grapple with a change of perspective on everything. And so formation often happens through the hard things, and there are legitimately difficult things in the second half of life. But if we have before us, oh, but that's all leading to my formation, at least for me, it helps me to perceive that God is in this and that the whole process matters. And that gets us to the second basic premise for that class, and it's just this general awareness that across fields, whether religious or not, there's this general recognition that life is divided in two halves. There's the first half of life, which is very much egocentric. It's about building up, making a name for yourself, a reputation, learning to survive in this world, gathering things unto yourself. And then the second half of life, which tends to be a more corporate understanding, just like the sermon on Sunday. It's no longer just I, but it is increasingly we. Who am I in relationship with you? It is learning to become more honest, not just what ought I to believe or what did I wish were true of me, but what just is? What is true of me? Learning to live into the particularity of our actual lives. All of this is kind of second half of life stuff. And what we're talking about in this class is principally just exploring what this second half of life looks like, particularly the spirituality of it. And I heard a metaphor the other day that I thought was useful, and it compared painting to sculpture, especially oil painting. With painting, where you keep doing layer upon layer of building up, you're adding to, whereas sculpture is cutting away until what you're left with is the true thing. Like it might be apocryphal, but didn't Michelangelo or something say, with sculpture, you just take away everything that isn't the lion. What you're left with is the lion. So second half of life is like sculpture. You're learning to let go of things till what you're left with is Marilyn. Fully. So that's my review. That's it. So, any questions, comments? Moving forward, I want to explore this idea of letting go. In some ways, we've been talking about that throughout the lecture, but I want to talk specifically first just about possessions. Most people in this season of life talk about downsizing. It's time to downsize. Well, I just want to explore that a little bit, both as a practical thing as well as a spiritual thing. The first thing is I want to affirm the value of possessions. We are physical, incarnate creatures. We live in actual houses. We put clothes on our actual body. We need real food. This physical life matters. God did not make us to be spirits in the clouds. God made us in creation, and therefore the stuff associated with our life has worth. Now, we could use it badly, but as a general principle, stuff actually matters. And the things that we acquire over the course of a lifetime, quite often at this stage of life, what they really have power now isn't just their material worth, but what they mean. I got this on the vacation with my husband who's now dead. I remember what it felt like to be in Italy. I remember buying this together, and the thing is now a symbol for the experience, which is your life. And quite often it could have a relational element too, which is central to who we are. And so these things have real worth in as much as they are a symbol of the life we have lived, which absolutely matters. And in addition to stuff we've acquired, there's also the whole issue of family heirlooms. You have inherited your grandmother's china, and even if you didn't use it, you know it mattered to her. Or you remember being at your mother's house at Thanksgiving and what it mattered to her. And even if you never even use your mother's china, you've got this heirloom which speaks of who you come from. And again, that really matters. We don't exist in isolation. We come from a people. And these heirlooms have legitimate worth as they represent that larger sense of our identity and our heritage. However, the letting go season will require letting go some of these things we've acquired or some things from our past, our heirlooms. But it matters to recognize that they have worth, even from a Christian spiritual perspective, because they have symbolic worth. And their season, in many cases, has come to an end. And with heirlooms, it can be particularly painful when the next generation doesn't want them. And I think it's worth recognizing that what it means to you does not have the same value for them. So please have grace towards that next generation when they choose not to retain what you chose to retain in your life. We cannot become museums for everything. We have to let go, and it is painful. Many of you have seen Maria Conde, I think her name is, or heard of her. She has this whole decluttering program on Netflix. I've never watched it. I've just learned a principle that she shared that I think has real worth, and that's learning to take something, a physical something, and to tell it, thank you. Like say it's the plate you bought in Italy with your husband. To be able to hold that in your hand, to recognize what it meant to you, and to tell it thank you for what value it has had in your life. That thank you process could also be a thank you to the person who shares the memory of its worth. Again, the plate you bought with your husband. In saying thank you to that, your husband may be dead, but you're in that moment of holding it saying, thank you, husband, who shared this life with me. And ultimately, it's a thank you, God, for giving me a life that allowed the richness that is symbolized in this thing. And I think there is real wisdom in letting go of something if you take time to recognize its worth and to say thank you. On a practical level, you can choose to photograph it. And the reason I say this is it's a halfway of letting go, especially say you're moving into a retirement home and you're going from a 2,500 square foot apartment to a studio, or house to a studio apartment. You've only got so much. And there's going to be some long, quiet days. If there's just a photo album that has these things, the image of them still triggers the memory of why it mattered and all the stories and relationships that are associated with it. In terms of leaving your legacy to your next generation, you could choose to make an album that has the picture and just some writing. It just be handwritten that says where this came from and why it mattered. And that's the kind of legacy your kids can keep. They can't keep all the stuff, but they could keep a book that has these stories. And that's where the story is passing on your legacy. So that's letting go of stuff. But of course, there's much more letting go. We talked about some of this in previous lectures, so I'll just touch on this briefly. There's the whole thing of letting go of control. Part of the aging process will mean there are some things I can no longer do or I can no longer contain control of, whether that's your finances, your car, your total independence, your authority in whatever organization you belong on. All of that falls into this big thing of letting go, and those same principles of saying thank you can still apply. You're letting go of your car to be able to say, I thank you for the years of independence. I thank you for what it felt like when I was 16 and I took off for the first time. And again, that thank you is just this recognition of your life. And that season's over, and of course you lament it, but to pause to thank it is good. I experienced one day a metaphor for this letting go process, and that's my lawn. Now, I've never been one of those perfect lawn guys, but I've certainly known the desire for a perfect lawn. And I've been noticing in my lawn right now, in the past several years, the dandelions are gaining more and more victory. And as the dandelions are taking over my lawn, I'm noticing a shift in how I regard it. When it first started happening, there was this resistance, and I'm losing control, and I hate it, and I'm a bad gardener, and why am I so lazy, and it's just horrible. And then I started looking at it, and I thought, okay, I don't care too much. Like, the dandelions are more natural than the grass anyway, and look, there's life happening. And then I was thinking of watching those dandelions flower and go to seed, and that used to be the enemy, right? That because the going to seed means it's now they're taking over. And nowadays, I kind of look at them and I increasingly think, boy, that's pretty. And that dandelion has worth unto itself. It too now is spreading its seeds to the next generation. And I was sharing this idea with someone else, and she said, it reminds me, Eric, of daisies. So if we shift our weed to the daisies right now, of the old trope of pulling off the petals, he loves me not, he loves me. And she said, but at this stage of life, all it is he loves me, he loves me, he loves me. That he loves me not is very much kind of a 15-year-old anxiety about, will I be lovable in this life? And if the arc of this life experience is going in the way it should, especially for us of faith, it ultimately connects us to God. And there's this idea, he loves me, he loves me. And so you lose control, but in losing control, it enters into this broadening appreciation. The lawn's not perfect, but look at all this biodiversity that's happening. So take that for what it's worth. Another thought of letting go, I just want us to consider the whole idea of bucket lists. I'm aware now in this generation that one's bucket list is kind of now a rite of passage for the retirement years. And I just want us to consider this privilege that our culture has adopted as our right. On one hand, this kind of enormous bucket list feels a lot like just a senior example of American acquisitiveness and self-centeredness. It's still all about me and all the experiences I could have, and I'm still grasping at it all. So I question the right of the bucket list. But that being said, I do absolutely believe that there is a place for that kind of well done, good and faithful servant. I was talking to someone who took a rather significant vacation recently, and in talking about it, she used the language of, I worked my whole life and saved this money, and to spend it on this trip right now, there was just this great sense of reward, and I don't want to undermine that. I totally believe in that, and especially in kind of the retirement, I'm still healthy and stable and capable. There's something to be celebrated in those years, so I don't want to squash it. But I do call into question kind of the really long bucket list, which brings me into the whole idea that this, the later season of life, the language I use of it is I think it's a season for increasing modesty. And what modesty means is it's not utter self-denial. You're not moving into a hermitage and throwing yourself naked into nettles and beating yourself up. Modesty just means I'm choosing to do with less. And when you do that, it creates more spaciousness. I have less house I need to maintain. I have less property I need to maintain. And actually, always pampering yourself takes a lot of energy. I used to have a lot of wealthy clients who I would go into their house to decorate, and I thought, my God, you're always just so busy with having to develop your property, and you're so stressed by it all the time. All these contractors who are forever in your house, and it's just, modesty means, yeah, I just don't have to bother with all that evermore. And your time and your energy, there's a more spaciousness. But the other thing with modesty is it's still recognized there are seasons for feasting. There are seasons for the fabulous trip, the taking your daughter out to a great dinner. You've got the money. You don't eat great meals every day. You eat modestly. But when it's time, when it's appropriate, you have the resources and the spirit to bless lavishly. So that's what I like about modesty. It's just generally simpler, and there's still times to feast, and there's times to fast. So, any thoughts on that? We got to this point in the lecture a little faster than I thought I would because we're already at our first discussion question. So I'm going to invite you to break up into pairs again and to ask the question, is there something in your life whose season has come to let go of it? That something could be possessions, it can be something you're still holding control of that you recognize. I think it is time to let go of control of that. It could also be a dream unfulfilled. You know, that you had this kind of idea in your life that in my life I'm going to fill in the blank, and you're recognizing that might not happen. And it's time to reckon with that. Or it could be anything else. So break into pairs, 5 minutes on, is there something in your life whose season has come to let go of? If only one of you has been sharing so far, this would be the point to swap who's sharing. All right, everyone. Let's gather back together. All right. In the literature that has to do with aging and successful aging, as it's often referred to, one of the phrases you'll run across quite a bit is life review, and recognizing that the later part of life just naturally involves what life review, this kind of we're looking back on what your life has been and just remembering stories, talking about, you'll often hear about people who are entering into the very old stage, how memories that had been quite archived for years and years suddenly come back, often from childhood. That there's just this natural time of life review. And the way that's understood is that who we are is simply a compilation of everything we've experienced. We don't really know anything other than what we have experienced, either physical activity or what we've heard and learned. You know, if Alberta shares a story, her story now is part of my experience because I heard it from her. But that's all you've got, is what you've experienced in one form or another. And what the life review process is you're kind of synthesizing everything. You're taking all this data of a lifetime of experience, and that which you've remembered, most of it is forgotten. But your brain has remembered various things for various reasons. It's all been stored in there, and the life review is you're just kind of like you're taking it all out on the table and sifting it out, trying to make sense of it. It's not necessarily a conscious process. It's a subconscious process. It just starts happening more and more. And you're just dealing with this issue of what has my life meant? What am I proud of? What am I ashamed of that I regret? Ultimately, who am I? And you're just kind of asking the question, what's it all about? You know, I think I've shared this with you before. When I was my 95-year-old grandmother's caregiver, she had significant dementia. She would sit out on her porch, and I'd come out to talk with her, and that's what she would always say. I wonder what it's all about. She was just sitting there in her demented mind, processing the whole thing. And from a faith perspective, I would say ultimately this is tapping into God. Who are you, God? What is this world you've made that I am a part of? What does it mean to be in a relationship with you and one another and with the whole created order? What's it all about? And I did read a theory once on elderly people who always tell the same story over and over again. They're in dementia, and there's just these stories that they keep repeating. It can be intolerable on our end when you're the caregiver to hear it as if for the first time over and over again. But this theory is that for whatever reason, these handful of stories have stuck. Most of life is forgotten, not those. And so that story must have some meaning, either as a symbol or as a representation of a larger experience in life. But it's stuck for some reason. And in telling it over and over again, there is a sense of trying to make sense of it, trying to do some kind of reconciliation on this whole life review thing, and that story is a way they're experiencing it. I don't know if that's true or not. Certainly the person who's at that stage of life can't tell you what they're doing. They don't remember that they told it to you 5 minutes ago. But it's a theory, and it's an attractive one to me. When I'm in relationship with someone who's doing that, it helps give me grace. But what this leads to is this larger theme of reconciliation. Now, reconciliation can take on many meanings. One of them is reconciliation in terms of integration. Like you're taking all these things in this life review process and you're just fitting them together. You're reconciling what you've experienced, for good or for bad, and putting it into some sense of overarching meaning making. So that's one form of reconciliation. You could also be reconciling your experiences. What happened to me? How did that shape me? How am I coming to understand that? I was talking to someone recently who shared a very pivotal experience as a child, and their recognition of how that led to their pattern of behavior and how they now function out of it. That's a reconciling kind of process where you're understanding this is what happened, this is how it affected me, this is now how I have lived. You're reconciling your experiences. But the most common category of reconciliation, what I want to look at now, is in interpersonal relationships. Who we are in community is one of the most significant aspects of our existence. And most relationships have had some degree of rupture. It might just be a single isolated event. It might be an enormously formative event. Your husband who had an affair and left you, and so I want us to look at this idea of reconciliation as a major theme of the second half of life, because you are now postured to deal with it in a better way than you ever have. And part of the reason is you are now in the second half of life in which there is a little more time. You are already doing this life review. You are trying to reconcile things. It's no longer just about that bastard who did this to me, as much as how did that affect me? Who do I understand myself to be? You're trying to piece it all together. But also what I'm finding, I'm early in the second half of life, right? I'm a neophyte, but one who hangs out with a oldophyte quite a bit. I've probably told you this before. My spiritual director said this once, and as soon as I heard it, I thought, I think that's true. And her statement was, everyone's always doing the best job they can. It doesn't mean they're doing a good job or they're making the best decision. It could be that given a circumstance, they are choosing to turn to their unhealthy coping mechanism. Life just got overwhelming, and so I'm going to go give myself over to my gambling addiction. That's not a good choice, but in the moment, given their options, it was the best choice they could make because they're still seeking comfort in gambling. And what I appreciated about that wisdom, everyone's always doing the best job they can, is it allows you to respond to someone else's behavior with a gracious posture versus a judgmental one. You might still wish they had chose otherwise, particularly how it affects you, but you could still say you're doing the best you can. And I heard another phrase. This was in a story Anne Lamont was telling, and it had to do with some alcoholic who was stumbling drunk. I forget all the circumstances. But the end comment was, someone was describing just how they were falling apart, and the response was simply, that sounds about right. Again, it's not permissive. It's not to say, oh, that's a good choice of behavior, but given your life story and what it's looked like so far, for you to be behaving this way right now, that sounds about right. And I found I use that in pastoral care relationships all the time now. Because you listen to people's life struggles and how they responded. They're full of anguish and grief and fear and anxiety about it. And I just hear it and I think, that's reasonable. You know, I might desire otherwise for you. I'm certainly happy to talk about what's going on here and how might you live otherwise. But the fact that that's how you're responding, that sounds about right. And so at this season of life, as we're seeking reconciliation in those relationships that have known some rupture, I think we are better positioned now than we were then to have that kind of, you're doing the best you could. That sounds about right. Graciousness towards them, which if you're starting to shift into such a more gracious way of regarding them, how much easier it is to enter into reconciliation. And those things I've said, everyone's doing the best they can, and that sounds about right. We also learn to say that to ourselves. I was telling that to someone in a conversation just yesterday. When I behave badly now, I still wish I hadn't, but I don't beat myself up as much. I've learned enough of myself to think, given the circumstances, it's reasonable that you responded that way. It's not good. You still hurt someone, or you still did something damaging to yourself, but that's reasonable. And so you've heard me talk about this before. We've used it as a Lenten theme, I think, at one point, but it ties into this whole issue of reconciliation. Hospice workers and chaplains who deal with end-of-life relationships have identified 5 principal conversations that are necessary to have with someone before they die. These conversations tap into the most elemental aspects of our relationship. The first one is thank you. You just tell another person, thank you for fill in the blank. It might be something specific or who they were in their life, anything that they've contributed to this world or to you that you're grateful for. And it just taps into this whole idea of gratitude. Healthy living is one that generally fosters gratitude. And to be able to tell Marilyn, thank you for, is essential to relationships. The second is, I am sorry, or its companion, please forgive me. We're going to talk about more of that in a little bit, but it's just this general posture of repentance. Related to that is the third conversation, I forgive you. If we are in relationship with other people to any significant degree, by and large, there will be something to forgive because we are broken people and our brokenness butts up against one another. We often don't choose it in any active way, it just happens. And so I forgive you is an essential conversation to have. I love you. In many ways, everything we've been doing in this life is a seeking after that elemental aspect. I desire to love, and I desire to be loved. Most of our bad behavior stems from a belief that that's not true of us. And so if there are relationships that you can say, I love you, that's just an elemental thing. And finally, the last conversation is goodbye. It's important for you to be able to say goodbye. It's important for them to hear it. On a practical level, people often talk about the received wisdom of giving a dying person permission to die. That quite often in relationships, there's kind of this tenacity of holding on to this life for whatever reason. And part of love is telling that dying person, you could go now. We're going to be okay. Related to that, people in hospice will often tell 2 versions of the same story, in that someone is holding on, waiting till Joe can get there to be able to say goodbye before dying. But then the reverse can often be true too, of the dying person waiting for someone to leave. That they don't want to die with them in the room. It could be a parent who still has this sense, I need to take care of my kid, and I can't take care of you if I can't die if you're still here. I need you to leave the room so I could do this on my own. So they're 2 sides of the same coin. But I would say that if these 5 conversations are important to have with the dying, how much more important to have with the living? If they are these elemental issues of what it means to be in relationship with someone else, don't wait. In one way or another, have these conversations now. And it doesn't need to be a formal, we need to sit down and have these 5 conversations. Part of it is just you thinking through them. If you're a journaler, it could be something you choose to journal, just to pick a person who's important in your life, living or dead, and just think through these 5 things and to be able to think it through. That's absolutely a method of life review, because you're processing at the most basic level who these people are to you. And I could share the story. I often share these 5 questions, especially with families who are in a position of a loved one dying. And when my mother-in-law moved into our house, she very promptly began to die, and she was unconscious, and I thought to myself, well, should you have these 5 conversations with Dorothy? And I thought, I don't think that's necessary. One, you didn't have much of a relationship with her. She had already begun having strokes and wasn't all there by the time Cynthia and I were married. But then I thought, well, let me try it. And so out loud, I started having the 5 conversations, just going through the list. She was unconscious, but I still spoke them verbally with the belief that even if she can't physically hear me, I trust the Holy Spirit to be conveying this message. But as I started going through it, I realized I absolutely did need to have all 5 conversations with her. I'd been a pretty good son-in-law, but I wasn't a perfect one. There were ways that I had not honored her. There are ways I was mad at her for what she had done to Cynthia, and I needed to forgive her, and I needed to repent. And I cannot tell you how significant it was for me to have that verbal conversation with this unconscious dying woman. What this gets to, or the next big topic, is the whole notion of forgiveness. If reconciliation is a major theme of this life review, these later half of life, forgiveness is going to come up in one way or another. And the first thing I would say is it is clearly a Jesus priority. And again, I'm speaking here from a Christian faith perspective. But if we look at a couple key moments of Jesus' life and ministry, I'm just going to mention 2. The first is the Lord's Prayer. You know, when he tells us this is your pattern for prayer, which is kind of the center in many ways of the spiritual life, what is significant in that relatively brief prayer? Forgive us, Lord, as we forgive those. That who is God but the one who does forgive? And how are we to live as people of faith? As ones who live that way too. It is absolutely a Jesus priority. And then think about what was the almost last thing he said on the cross. That's right, forgive them, Lord. They do not know what they do. Like whatever atonement theology you have, that's up for discussion. But clearly, one of Jesus' last acts was forgiving those people who were responsible for his crucifixion. It's just essential to this life. And why? From a Christian perspective, because everything we believe in the gospel is that it is taking that which was broken and estranged and isolated and turning it into restoration and community and wholeness and relationship. Like the sermon on Sunday, this whole idea, we are not only I, we are also we. And if anything has broken that sense of being in community with one another, forgiveness is the ultimate power to reverse that. Because if you think about it, if anything can be forgiven, what is stronger than that? Nothing. Nothing ends up more powerful than that but to forgive. And if that's what God is doing, if that's what Jesus was modeling, and if we want to be like Jesus, choosing forgiveness is an essential part of our second half of life formation. Now let us be clear what forgiveness is not. It is not forgetting. You know, there's the whole phrase, forgive and forget. I reject that. Because the memory of forgiveness is an essential part of our ongoing existence and relationship. It is not just, I have not forgotten. I am prepared, because once I start, I don't stop. My experience with genuine forgiveness, both that which is given and that which is received, is it produces a depth of relationship at a whole nother level. The kind of love that can be exchanged through forgiveness is unlike any other. And I don't want to forget that. When I have been forgiven, you know, particularly in my most intimate relationships with Cynthia, when she has forgiven me, I hold on to that as the strength of our future relationship. Why would I forget it? And if that is the power of the gospel, why would I forget it? Because it is love. It is reconciliation. It is wholeness and restoration. And at a technical level, what are we doing when we forgive someone? At a most basic level, at least for me, what I am saying is, I release you from guilt or any future penalty for what you have done. Be it in any physical way or just a matter of the spirit, I no longer hold it against you. I was talking with someone just recently, and I forgave them. And I was clear to say, there is nothing between us anymore, and I meant it. Like, it was over. Now, this is a matter of the will. We can choose to offer forgiveness, but it's also a matter of the spirit, which is harder to control. And I'm going to talk more about that later. But I think at its heart, forgiveness is releasing someone completely from the guilt that they carry for how they've sinned against you. Marilyn?
It also releases us.
Mm-hmm.
Because with that forgiveness, someone attached may well be anger.
Yeah.
May well be well-justified anger. And in forgiving, whether or not that other person is even present, we're releasing emotional triggers.
Absolutely.
We can be.
Again, we can't control the emotion, but it is freeing for the person, it is freeing for you. And again, I think this is absolutely speaks to the substance of what the gospel is. Everyone is freed. Everyone is restored. It's a broad experience. In my reckoning, I see 3 different categories of forgiveness. There might be far more. This does not come from any wise person. This is just as I think about it in my own experience. And I base them by the degree of difficulty. For me, the most desirable experience of forgiveness is when it is actually done in relationship with someone who is repenting. Someone who has hurt me, who has recognized it, has come to me already in a posture of remorse to say, I did this to you, and I am aware of how it affected you, and I am so sorry. If someone comes to me with that, it is not difficult at all to say, I forgive you, and to mean it, and then to be able to enter into the richness of the restored relationship. Hands down, that's the preferable experience of forgiveness. The next one, I would say, is forgiving the one who is no longer a part of your life. It may be someone who has died, or they're not, some bully who hurt you in high school. You haven't seen them in 50 years. But there was actually, in this life review process, you realize, I've carried the pain of that sin against me all these years. I'm aware now how caring that has affected me, how I have learned to protect myself from that in this way that isn't my friend any longer. So someone who's dead, someone who's no longer in your life, you don't get the rich relational experience, but that one also isn't terribly hard to forgive if you are now in a posture where you want to, because they're no longer there to hurt you anymore. In a lot of relationships, where the forgiveness is required, it is not just an isolated event. It is a pattern of behavior, because that person, just like you, is a broken person. And their manifestation of brokenness is in this repeated behavior. And whether they're aware of it or not, they're going to keep doing it to you. But if they're dead, they're not going to keep doing it to you, and it's actually it's not so hard to forgive them if you're in a mindset where you want to forgive them. The hardest kind of forgiveness is that person who is still in your life, who has not repented and shows no interest in repenting, because you're still vulnerable to being hurt by them. That one's the hardest. And it's just worth naming it. I'm not saying don't do it, I'm just saying it's going to be harder than the other 2. And here's some recent thinking I have on the whole oh, go ahead, Pat.
Should we back up to that again?
Mm-hmm.
The person in your life who hasn't repented for what they did to you.
Yeah.
And you're still trying to forgive them. Because there's some action steps that you can take yourself internally so that you can forgive them, so that they don't have that hold on you.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that next. But I will say, this isn't in my notes, if you are in a relationship with someone whose brokenness is continuing to affect you, it is wise and appropriate to put up boundaries. In extreme situations, it means you remove yourself from them completely. Your behavior is too damaging to me and I cannot live with it, so you put up a very big boundary. In other cases, it may mean you're just learning behavior to remove yourself, like you see the signs coming up, and to remove yourself from it. So that is not unchristian, to protect yourself from a condition of ongoing abuse. Okay. Here's my current thinking on forgiveness. There is some conventional wisdom out there that will try to motivate us to pursue forgiveness with the idea that it's good for you. That why do you want to forgive? So that the abuser's effect on you no longer has the power to keep festering within you. So because it's beneficial for you, that's why you would pursue forgiveness. And I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just beginning to think there's a deeper layer of wisdom, and that is, do you desire the other person's good? Because that first level of wisdom is, you're desiring your own good, which is fine and healthy and normal. You should desire your own good. But this deeper layer is, do you desire their good? Because that's a totally different level. And why I find that to be so compelling in this topic of forgiveness is the recognition that if you desire their good, you actually have within you the resource to help provide their good, which is the forgiveness of them. And what convinces me of this worth is, to me, this reeks of the gospel. I don't know if you could use reek in a positive way. It totally has the aroma of the gospel, because to me, it reflects a Jesus-like priority, that to desire the other's good. I desire unity. I desire your well-being. Even if you're my enemy, pray for those who persecute you, says Jesus, to bless one another, to know yourself as one with the other, to have a posture that says, even for my abuser, I desire your good. That feels like the heart of the kingdom of God that Jesus modeled for us. And if you've gotten yourself in this position where you recognize, I do desire your good, at that point, forgiveness becomes a lot less difficult. Because you desire your good, you desire to see them set free from the guilt they do carry. Whether they're admitting to the pain of being that broken person or not, you can forgive them. And how this works in the spiritual realm, I can't even claim to understand, but I think there is a bigger reality. I believe we are connected to one another, and our ability to forgive is a participation in that healing reality. Whereas if we're still just doing our best to love that bastard because we're supposed to, it's going to be a constant battle. But fair enough, if that's where you are, that's got to be your starting point. I heard a speaker once. He was a pastor, and he was telling the story. On his office desk was a photograph of his sister and her family with her husband and kids, and the husband was her murderer. His sister had been killed by her, and a parishioner walked into his office once, saw him in the framed picture, and said, "Pastor, why do you have a picture of him on your desk?" And his answer was, "So I remember to pray for the son of a bitch." And what I love about that, it was honest. He wasn't claiming a piety or a love beyond what was true for him, but he was choosing to position himself where I choose to desire your good, even if I don't yet desire your good. And when I see your picture, I remember to pray for the son of a bitch. If you don't like that language, language I have used more is, God, I want to love them. Or, God, I desire their good. That's a step before forgiving, but it's a starting to pivot yourself to say, that person does function as my enemy. That might feel like an extreme word, but sometimes extreme words are helpful for clarifying. They're my enemy because they have hurt me, or they are hurting someone I love. They might not be hurting you personally, but they're abusing your daughter. I desire to want their good is a step towards forgiveness. In many cases, the forgiveness we are pursuing, especially in the second half of life, are big issues. If it's still alive in you, it was probably a significant form of hurt. For me, you all know, my mother left my father and my brother and me when I was 3 years old. She left him to go live with another man and marry him. I've been a Christian since I was 4. My whole Christian life, I've been mindful of the fact that your mother sinned against you, and I've been watching it my whole life. We were never in animosity. We continued to have a good relationship. But as I got older, I recognized a lot of my struggles clearly are connected to the fact that my mother abandoned me at a formative age. When she was dying, I felt myself being angry at her in ways I never had in my life. I think I'd never given myself permission to. But as she was reaching the end of her life, I found myself getting mad, and I thought, that's probably good. Those have been repressed emotions that good Christians aren't supposed to have. Well, this good Christian was actually really hurt by it. And I am pretty mad. My brother and I sat her down at one point and said, Mom, will you tell us how you justified leaving us? We understand why you left Dad. How did you justify leaving us? And her response was, it was too hard, so I had to bracket you out. My brothers said, your expression at that point was fill in the blank. It's not a word that's appropriate to say in the name of the church or online. I was furious, because not only did I hear that language of I chose to bracket you out, I thought, of course you did. That's exactly what you did. And all these things I experienced, I could see how that was a result of you bracketing me out. So I got angry, and I was glad I had permission. It was probably an appropriate thing because I wanted to go through a deeper reconciliation process before she died. The last time I saw her conscious, we'd said, Mom, what do you want to do today? She said, I want to go up to the lake one more time. She wanted to see Lake Tahoe. They lived just below it. So we drove her up to the lake, and I realized I don't have much more time with her. We're sitting there at the lake, and I said, Mom, it may be that you have apologized for this in the past, but I have no memory of it. I said, I've never heard you say you're sorry for leaving me. And she said, oh, Eric, I am so sorry. Is that a squirrel? Because she was on so many pain drugs, her mind was just kind of batty and all over the place. Is that a squirrel? And I remember kind of laughing and thinking, you asked for what you wanted, which was her repentance. She gave it to you, and in that moment, I believe it was sincere, and then it was over. And if that's all you're going to get, I'll take it. I'll take it. And then the night she died, I remember there was this powerful desert wind blowing, and it was 2 in the morning, and I go walking out, and this wind is just blowing. And it was a pretty raw moment. And that wind became as the gift of the Holy Spirit. And my prayer was, God, blow everything away that was untrue of who she was, that she lived with her whole life. Blow it away and receive her unto yourself. And then I prayed, and blow away everything that she put on me that was also not true, because I'm tired of living with it. It was cathartic. And through that whole process of her dying, I forgave her completely. And the way I know I have is the way I now know myself to be at peace with her. And how do I say it? I want to honor her. Even in sharing that story with you right now, there's a sense, do you even want to share that? This thing that speaks badly about her? Because I want to honor her memory, not in any kind of myth-telling kind of way, but I have no desire to shame her or to tell bad things about her. I only want her good. I know that that's true. And that's all to say, that was a 45-year journey. That forgiveness can take a very long time. But I know I desired her good. And I'm glad that I got to be part of making it so. On the flip side of forgiveness is the other side of the story, which is repentance, which is when we are the person who is at fault. And again, part of life review, part of second half of life spirituality is entering into a season when you are more willing to be honest about what you did, the effect it had, and that you have more wisdom to understand why. And so here is my thoughts on how to repent. First, it's something you do alone. It's you thinking this through. It's very much part of this whole life review thing. And it's finally being able to name something for what it was. What did I do? Why did I do it? As well as you could understand. And beginning to look at it from their perspective. How did my sin hurt them? And part of this is, were they, especially if it's a complex relationship, were they hurting you at the same time? Yeah, probably. Is it in some way a protective way against their abuse? Sure. But you're at a point now where you could say, all that may be true, but that's not what I'm looking at right now. I'm just recognizing the fact that when I behaved this way, it had this effect on them. And to allow yourself to feel the sorrow of it, to recognize that my sin led to your suffering. This is all very personal work you're doing. Now, you might choose to involve someone else in the process, a trusted person who you could process it through. You might also, at this point, choose to participate in the rite of reconciliation. This is the sacramental rite in the church where you actually name your sin verbally to a priest. And you have that priest pronounce the forgiveness over you in the name of God and the church. That sometimes just the general confession every Sunday isn't enough. You need to actually say it out loud, and you need to hear another person pronounce the forgiveness on you. And part of that is a relational experience you have with the priest, in that I have shared this thing of which I am ashamed. I have heard them say I am forgiven, and I experience in that relationship that I'm still acceptable. Because the reason we hide from our shame and our sin is just this basic belief that if this were known about me, I would be rejected. So even to be accepted at that sacramental level has some psychological benefit to helping you believe that you can be forgiven for this. And certainly, it has the spiritual benefit. We're talking about God ultimately. It's a pronouncement that God does forgive you. And there is nothing God cannot forgive. If that is not true, then we should stop being the church. Everything is forgivable. And so that the rite of reconciliation could be a very useful rite to help you in this process of actually repenting to the person, because it will get you in a better place to have the strength and courage to do what you need to do. And then to think through, when I talk to this person, plan what you're going to do. And in particular, what you need to plan is how to be able to name your sin honestly, without euphemisms, and without excuses. Now, there could likely be a larger conversation that comes in that reconciliation moment in which there is some shared understanding about it makes sense that you would behave that way. But in the point of actually seeking forgiveness, you need not to be seeking excuses, because at that point you're saying it's not my fault. You need to be able to name it honestly. And then, when you're ready, choose to talk to the person. It's often helpful to invite someone into a conversation, not at the moment, but down the road. Can we get together for coffee next week? And to give them some indication of the tone of the conversation. There's something very difficult that I want to share with you. You don't even need to say I'm repenting at this point, but you're letting that person know that this is going to be a real conversation. There's going to be some substance to it, and it's going to be hard for me. So whatever language works, you're just giving them a heads up for the tone of the conversation, so it allows them to enter in a very deliberate, gracious posture as well. And then you tell them, I want to apologize for what I did, and you've already done this work, so you name it. No euphemisms, no excuses. I want to apologize for what I did. It might be at that point that they're going to try to resist what you're doing. Oh, it wasn't that big a deal. And you could just say, I appreciate that, but please hear me out. It's a big deal to me. If it's at a point this is actually something you're pursuing reconciliation on, it is a big deal to you. So you don't, they're just trying to make it comfortable. It's not that big a deal. I appreciate that. It's a big deal to me. Please hear me out. And be explicit in your apology. Make sure that the language you're using is very clearly, I am apologizing because I did wrong and it hurt you. Quite often when I'm having those interactions, I'll find the person doesn't actually forgive me because we are so culturally unused to doing this that we don't know how to do it well, and they're so caught off guard that it's okay. And if they haven't forgiven me, I'll ask for it. To say, and normally you could tell if they're choosing to forgive you just by their whole tone, but to be able to say, do you forgive me? You cannot demand someone's forgiveness. That is theirs to give or not give, for whatever reason. You could only choose what you choose, but if you think that they're trying to forgive you, they just haven't done it, you could ask, do you forgive me? And they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, of course I forgive you. But that clarity is really helpful. If what we're after is reconciliation, we need to hear the actual words. So that's my advice to you. But then there's a later step, and that's to choose to receive that forgiveness and move on. Because what our human spirit wants to do is keep beating ourselves up, to keep reliving it and saying, what a bad boy am I. But if someone has forgiven you, part of maturation is accepting it and moving on. I remember I was telling someone this the other day. On our honeymoon, I totally trampled over a deeply held dream of Cynthia's. I was so insensitive. And as soon as it came out, it was so obvious what I had done. We talked it through. She looked at me and said, Eric, I forgive you. And I remember stopping and looking at her and thinking, if you're going to make this, if this marriage is going to succeed, guaranteed you're going to keep hurting each other. You're going to have to keep forgiving each other, and you're going to have to keep receiving it. Because I wanted to keep beating myself up. I trampled a dream of hers. There was no going backwards on that. But she told me she forgave me. And it was a deliberate choice to say, okay. And that, of anything in our marriage, was this rock about how we were going to move forward. So, we've only got 20 more minutes. I'm going to skip this discussion question because I'm so impressed with what I have to say. Now I'm going to start rushing. But you see it written down there. It might be a conversation you choose to have afterwards, or you want to think on your own. Is there some reconciliation you need to pursue with the living or the dead? Okay. All right. This brings us to the theme of the communion of saints, which is this whole idea, if we are reconciled with those who have died, what is the communion of saints? In our theological posture, we believe that those who have died have returned to Christ, and that they are in Christ, and we are in Christ, the living and the dead together continue to be one community, and our spirituality invites us to perceive ourselves as still in living relationship with those who have gone before. That's why we have the memorial garden on our property, as this sign that the church is the living and the dead together, that in Christ there actually is not a boundary. And as we age, there are an increasing number of intimates who are on the other side of the veil. The older we get, the more our closest relationships are in the communion of saints. Our theology says that we are one, and I think it is permissive to experiment with living into the reality of that ongoing relationship. And I say experiment because I have no authority on this. First of all, because I am so young. Although I have loved ones who have died, I'm not at that season of life when the bulk of my closest relationships are dead. So I've only begun to experiment with this. But part of what I believe is that if they indeed are alive with Christ, then they are past all suffering and all brokenness, that they are more truly themselves than ever they were before, and that with Christ they are filled with grace. And just like relating to God can sometimes be easier than relating with one another, because at least in that relationship one of us is perfect, the same is true with those who have died, I believe. My friend Teresa tells a story. She'd had a very pain-filled relationship with her mother, who was very judgmental of her. And at one point, Teresa's an adult, and her adult daughter was making very bad choices in life to deal with drugs or whatever, and she had this thought, oh, what would my mother say? You know, she who has always been so judgmental of me, what a failure I am as a mother with my adult daughter on drugs. And suddenly there was this clarity that thought, my mother would love me. My mother does love me. That all that brokenness from our relationship is over. That she is in the communion of saints with me. And she entered into a depth of relationship with her dead mother that far exceeded anything she had known in this life. So I want to talk about dying itself, because this, of course, is where this whole thing is leading to. The first thing I want to do is look at Jesus' experience of dying, because the story actually contains a lot of details that I think provide kind of a motif of what the end of life looks like. And the first was there are a lot of conditions he could not control. He had been nailed to the cross. He couldn't even control the movement of his own body, right? He was naked, he was exposed, and there was no covering himself. And that becomes increasingly true the closer we get to death, is that there's less and less than we could control. His enemies received his possessions. Remember, they gambled for his clothes because it was a valuable cloak. And I think there's something interesting in that point, that what all of us will have to do is let go of our physical possessions, and whether they're given to our children and grandchildren, or even the extreme case, an enemy got them, Jesus experienced at the end of his life that his physical things were taken away from them, and it was beyond his control. He was also crucified between two criminals, and what that speaks to me of is that at the end of days, the just and the unjust experience the same thing. Jesus led this blameless life. These criminals didn't, but they were experiencing the exact same thing, which will be true of us. At one point, each of us will die, whether we were good or bad. And it might be a painful death, whether we were good or bad. And there's this very common experience that's beyond our control. But then he also models for us things that were within his control. The first was making provision for his mother. Remember, it's believed that the disciple being spoken of is probably John. But John and Mary are both there. He's on the cross, and he says to John, behold your mother. To his mother, behold your son. Like one of his last dying acts was to make sure his mother was taken care of. And I find that extraordinary. No matter how far we get towards the jumping off point, there are some things we still have control of. And we are responsible for doing as best as we can with those. The other thing he modeled for us was an honest prayer of lament. I often consider this prayer, my God, why have you forsaken me? What Jesus felt at that point was abandonment from God. And if you think about that on a Trinitarian level, the mind boggles. But what he modeled for us is you don't have to have right theology. I don't think he was abandoned by God, but he felt like he was, and his final prayer was, why have you abandoned me? If you are feeling despairing at the end of life, just be honest. We don't need fake piety at this point. We need honesty. because God meets us in the honesty. And then what we already discussed, forgiveness. That one of his last dying acts, forgive them, those who were responsible for his murder. And there's that added line, they know not what they do, which speaks to me of a deep kind of wisdom and compassion. They are guilty for killing him. He is releasing them from the sin of that guilt, but he's also doing it from the posture of they don't know what they're doing. To use the language earlier on in the lecture, everyone's doing the best job they can. If the Pharisees and religious leaders were ultimately responsible for the actions that led to his crucifixion, they were trying to live out their religiosity in what they thought was the most faithful way, even though it was contrary to the heart of God and the heart of the law. They don't know what they're doing. And then I recognize in Jesus' crucifixion that there's one example of something that is both within his control and not his control, and that was his last words. Do you remember what they were? It is finished. That's right. Into your hands I commend. It is finished. And I say that's in both categories because on the one hand, I think we do have volition in our dying. There are enough stories of dying people to recognize that they had agency in when they finally breathed their last breath. And it ultimately is God's call. So that's both. It is our issue and it's God's issue. Jeff? Yes. Yeah, I want to talk about that in a minute. It's in my next section here. Thank you. Jeff was just saying that many people die alone. I would say in the end, everyone dies alone. And so let me get to that. Further thoughts on dying. I believe, as based on the first premise of this lecture, that if the whole arc of life matters, the dying bit really has to matter. If that's our last jumping off point of the formation that's going to happen on this side of the veil, it must be really important. I said something once in a conversation with someone, and as soon as I said it, I believed it to be true. And that was, death is our enemy until it is not. Everything in us is designed to resist death. It is the enemy until it isn't. I remember I was in high school when I had this literal dream. And in this dream, I was in a black forest. It was all totally dark, except I could see a light that was glowing in the brambles. And I knew that light was death. And everything in me was resisting it because I knew if I succumbed to it, I would succumb to death. And so in this dream, I'm just resisting that light. And then at one point, I stopped. And I fell into it and died. They say you don't die in your dreams, but it's not true. I did. But what was fascinating is that when I stopped resisting it, I was at total peace to be joined to it. And I think in this life, it is appropriate for us to resist death in all its forms every step of the way until it's not. Death is our enemy, and then death becomes our friend. If you've ever looked at the pictures in my office, it's the canticle of St. Francis to Brother Sun. And the last verse of that canticle, it's all about his relationship with nature and calling all of nature to be in kinship and worship of God. Shortly before his death, he added another verse to the canticle, and it called it Sister Death.
Sorry, I'm going completely secular.
That's fine.
One of the most powerful pieces of all the Harry Potter writing comes at the very end when it talks about the Deathly Hallows. And the final of the Deathly Hallows is to recognize death and treat it as an old friend.
That's right. If you couldn't hear Marilyn, it was coming out of the Deathly Hallows in the Harry Potter series where death is now greeted as an old friend. So I want to make some basic points about dying. And the first is there are no authorities in this life about what dying involves, because the only authorities are those who have been through it, and they're not telling us about it. There are many people who bear witness from the outside. That is qualitatively a different experience than being the one who is dying. So there are no authorities on this. And this gets to what I was responding to Jeff earlier. I recognize, having been at many deathbeds, that ultimately dying is always a solitary act. It does not matter how many loved ones are gathered around the bed, the dying one is the only dying one. Everyone else is outside the experience. They're having their own experience of being bereaved, which is legitimate and important. That person is alone experiencing death. And what they're experiencing is totally beyond our perception. They might have some behavior or words that we try to interpret, but really we don't know what the person's experiencing. And quite often, the last days, the person is unconscious, either naturally or medically. They tend to sedate people who are in pain. And so they are still living, but they are transitioning over, and what they're experiencing is totally unknown to us. But I could often say that when I'm with someone who has died, most often the strongest emotion I have when it's all over is I am proud of them, that they did it. Excuse me. They made it. They made it through this whole life, and they made it through that transition, which is often really painful. And whatever this life on earth meant, they did it. And I'm just proud of them. That brings us to a rule of thumb. When you are with a dying person, always interact with them as if they can understand what you are saying or doing. It might be that quite literally they can, that their hearing is still functioning, but they don't have the ability to respond in any demonstrable way. So they might literally be able to hear you. Certainly at a spiritual level, I believe the Holy Spirit who makes us one, whatever essential thing needs to be happening at that transition from their dying and your remaining, if it's important to God, I trust that God will make sure they hear it. And it also keeps you engaged with them relationally. If you start speaking about them with the other people in the room, you're already disconnecting from them. But so long as you've still got them, keep talking to them. Okay. And like I say, I have to trust that the Spirit is part of this whole thing. The Holy Spirit is God with us and in us together. And regardless of what I can see or understand, a deathbed is an occasion to say the Spirit of God is at work. And I am also convinced that dementia and Alzheimer's, which is a barrier between us, is not a barrier between God and that person. And I believe that. And not only is it not a barrier, I am increasingly beginning to suspect that it might actually be a grace that is softening someone's ability to interact with God in the spiritual realm. As someone gets more disconnected from the realities of this life, I think that loosening might actually be permitting our areas of self-reliance and self-control and all our coping mechanisms. If those are starting to soften, I can only believe that that must mean an openness to what God is doing. And so when I'm with Alzheimer's patients now, I don't pity them in the way I used to. They're still having a real life. God is still with them. Of course, there are things that are difficult, especially when you see them distressed or whatever. Of course, you could feel sorrow for that. But in terms of their just existence, it could be that there is actually something beneficial happening. I say that lightly as one who does not have it. Just a thought. The next thing I want to address, which is related to that, is the experience of pain and dying. And it's worth saying that at this point of the lecture, I'm speaking of both our experience of the dying and our own dying, that these issues are equally true. In many cases, the end of life can include much pain. And my observation is that when this happens, contending with the pain for the person who has it takes most of their energy. So what happens is, for you who are with them, it's agonizing because you are powerless to relieve them from this pain. All you could do is ask the doctors to give them more and more drugs. but you feel, I love you so much, I am losing you, I hate to see you like this, and I can do nothing. So it's agonizing for you. It's also clearly agonizing for them. And they often don't have the relational attentiveness that you would desire at that point of separation. If all of their energy is just going into managing this pain they're dealing with, they can't talk to you about how much they love you and how much they appreciate. Maybe sometimes, but it's just my observation that all the energy just goes into managing the pain. And from a theological perspective, the way I regard this, and I say this as carefully as I can because I have not known pain in this life, and physical pain or chronic pain. But I see in it that this world is filled with pain. And we're talking about just physical pain at this point. There are people throughout this world who are dealing with physical pain a lot in ways I, in my privileged world, have never dealt with. But I've chosen to trust that God is with those people in this pain-filled world. And if at the end of life I must enter into my own season of significant pain, or I should have to bear witness to a loved one who's dealing with it, there's a part of me that says this kind of suffering has always been true in this world. There are those who have had to live with it far more than I have had to, or my loved one has had to, and it is now my turn. And I am choosing to trust that God will be as in this as he is in it with anyone who suffers, and he has been in it with me when I was not suffering. And again, I say that carefully because I don't know it, but I have to choose to trust it because I witness the end of life often involves it. And God, you've got to be there too. And if it's my turn to know this kind of solidarity, so be it. I recognize, too, in the process of dying, that if this whole second half of life was a letting go of my coping mechanisms, that the final stage of life, the actual dying part, ultimately becomes me finally letting go of everything. Up until that point, much of it has been my choice. If I choose to lay down my life and my comfort and privilege to bless someone else, that's my intentional posture of discipleship, choosing to enter into Christ-likeness, but it's still my choice. It's going to reach a point when it's less and less my choice. If I reach a point when someone is having to clothe me and bathe me because I could no longer do it, I've let go of that part of myself. I'm laying myself down. But I have this sense that in the dying moment itself, finally, it is complete. And I have this picture in my mind of grace that's saying, for all my life of faith, I have been seeking to lay myself down more and more. But at this point, it's as if God is saying, bless you. That's enough. Your time has come. And I'm now taking it from you. And that's true whether death was long in coming or whether it just happened in an accident all at once. There's just this point where I think God says, that is enough. You've laid it down completely, and now I will pick you up again. Which brings us to the point, it is at 2 o'clock, 5 more minutes. What happens when you die? Now, of course, the honest answer is, I don't know, right, of course, right? I've never died before. We have some testimonies of people who have died on the operating table and then come back to life. Like they literally died, it shows, medically. You hear it often enough of this experience of having a sense of literally rising off the operating table and seeing the room and then going back in. Likewise, from the other side, I've heard it enough that I have to give credence to it, that many people at the moment of bereavement speak of the experience of knowing the presence of the person after they died. the bereaved person knowing the presence of the loved one after they died. They just feel it. I was just talking to someone 2 days ago who described that experience with her husband dying. She could literally see him. She has this concrete picture of him. I know Cynthia shares the story. Her father died while she was in transit trying to get there. And when she got there, and the next day we had the viewing, the casket was open, and she absolutely knew his presence. And then when the funeral happened, it was just a corpse. Her interpretation of it is Dad stayed present until we could say goodbye. You took Lucy kayaking. Yeah. Her friend Lucy who died, this sense of her being in the boat with you, right? Enough people report such a similar phenomena, I could only choose to believe there's something to it. What it means beyond that, I could have theological exploration, but that is the experience beyond Christianity as well. It's the human experience over and over, testimonies of this ilk. Which brings us to the final point on heaven. What is heaven? Again, the honest answer is, I don't know, never been there. But I believe it's real. And what I believe that reality means is, one, it is a continuation of the formation of life. If what we experience in this life is this ongoing process of increasingly becoming more and more truly ourselves as image bearers of God, I could only believe that what comes next is an ongoing formation. So it's continuation, but to be clear, it is not continuation of the status quo. It's not who we were when we died in relationship with our loved ones now just gets repeated in some Garden of Eden. I don't think it's a continuation of status quo. I think it's a continuation of ongoing formation. Again, we talked about this in a sermon at Easter time, just the testimony of Jesus. There was something physically familiar to him, and there's something physically different. At a physical level, he was not interacting with this physical world in the same way he had. And I suspect we continue to be physical, but it is in a way beyond our reckoning. We shared in an earlier lecture this metaphor of not even a metaphor, the reality of the acorn. The acorn mingles with the soil and the water and the warmth of the sun, and it turns into an oak tree. It never stopped being an acorn. You know, it was just a little sprout that grew and became a sapling, and before you knew it, it is nothing like an acorn, but it's a positive continuation of what was an acorn, which literally gets put in the soil. And exactly right, and it's part of this ongoing thing. So I think whatever heaven is, I think it's real. I think there's a physical reality to it, but heaven is to earth as oak tree is to acorn, is where I stand on it right now. Which brings us to the whole point of relationships. We, of course, have the desire for ongoing relationships with those who have died. And again, I think there is continuity, but it keeps growing into levels of relating that are simply beyond what we have known in this life. It's especially to deal with husbands and wives often ask the question, or parents and children, our most intimate relationships. Will I continue to be in relationship with that person in heaven? And to quote Jesus, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given to marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Now, we don't know what angels are like in heaven, but I take the basic premise that marriage was a foretaste of a union of being that we could hardly begin to understand. So I think the relationship continues, but far more significantly. And it's not just the two of you anymore. I think it is a participation in the larger whole. Again, the sermon on Sunday about the Trinity, this idea that the very nature of God is the individual and the corporate. And my expectation of heaven is, yes, we continue to have those relationships in their particularity, but it's part of a much bigger reality of existing, and that it is more real, more concrete than what we know in this life. So let's leave it there. It is now 2:07. I'm 7 minutes beyond. We'll end the video recording right now, Chris, but but if you choose to stay for some conversation, there's some input from you I would like. And that has to do with, do you have any input on